In 1999, the town of Dryden County, Texas, was like any other small ranching community scattered across the vast expanse of the Lone Star State. Before we delve into this harrowing tale of disappearance and discovery, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced the eerie silence of the Texas plains during a dust storm. The disappearance of Frank Holden shook the community to its core. Frank wasn't just any rancher, he was a pillar of Dryden County, a third-generation cattle farmer whose family had weathered the Dust Bowl, economic downturns, and every hardship the harsh Texas landscape could throw at them. His 500-acre property, Windbreak Ranch, was marked by a distinctive old windmill that had stood since his grandfather's time, creaking and turning with the relentless Texas wind, pumping water from deep beneath the parched earth. On September 12, 1999, Frank told his wife Margaret he was heading out to check on a broken fence line near the north pasture. He kissed her goodbye, climbed into his white Ford pickup, and drove away from the farmhouse. It was the last time anyone would see Frank Holden alive. When Frank failed to return for dinner, Margaret wasn't immediately concerned. Ranch work was unpredictable, and it wasn't unusual for Frank to work late. But when midnight came and went with no sign of him, she called their nearest neighbor, Bill Hayward, who lived 3 miles down the road. Bill arrived at 1 a.m., and together they drove the property's perimeter. They found Frank's truck parked near the old windmill, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of Frank himself. By morning, Sheriff Tom Grady had organized a search party. 30 volunteers combed every inch of Windbreak Ranch. They checked ravines, water tanks, and outbuildings. They brought in dogs that picked up Frank's scent from the truck to the base of the windmill, but lost it there. It was as if Frank Holden had simply vanished into thin air. The life Frank left behind was one of quiet achievement. At 52, he had built Windbreak Ranch into one of the most successful cattle operations in the county. Photographs on the mantelpiece showed a tall, weather-beaten man with laugh lines around his eyes, always wearing his signature cream-colored Stetson. His marriage to Margaret, the local veterinarian, was approaching its 25th anniversary. Their 2 children, James and Ellie, had both left for college, James studying agricultural science at Texas A&M, Ellie pursuing a business degree at UT Austin. But beneath the surface of this seemingly idyllic life, there were currents of tension. The summer of 1999 had been brutally dry, stressing the cattle and depleting the ranch's financial reserves. Margaret would later tell investigators that Frank had been uncharacteristically tense in the weeks before his disappearance, often staying up late reviewing the ranch's books. There was also the matter of the land dispute with Hank Dawson, owner of the neighboring Big D Ranch. For years, Dawson had been trying to buy the northern 100 acres of Windbreak Ranch, land that included the old windmill, and access to the underground aquifer beneath it. Frank had consistently refused to sell, despite increasingly generous offers. Witnesses reported seeing the 2 men in a heated argument at the Dryden County Fair just a week before Frank vanished. The morning of September 12th began like any other Sunday for the Holdens. They attended the 9 a.m. service at Dryden Baptist Church, where Frank served as a deacon. They had lunch at the Crossroads Diner with the Haywards, their closest friends. Margaret recalled that Frank received a phone call during lunch that seemed to agitate him, though he brushed off her concerns. He merely said it was ranch business that needed attention. After lunch, they drove home together. Frank spent an hour in his office before emerging with his work gloves and announcing he needed to check the north fence line. Margaret offered to go with him, but he declined, saying he wouldn't be long. He drove away at approximately 3:30 p.m. According to the odometer on his truck, Frank drove exactly 4.7 miles from the farmhouse to the windmill. The fence line he had mentioned was visible from there about a quarter-mile further. Why he stopped at the windmill, parked, and apparently got out remained a mystery. There were no signs of struggle around the vehicle. His rifle remained mounted in the rear window rack. His cell phone, a recent purchase he had made reluctantly at Margaret's insistence, was found on the passenger seat, showing 1 missed call from a number that turned out to be Hank Dawson's. The initial search was comprehensive, but yielded nothing. Sheriff Grady expanded the search area to neighboring properties, including Dawson's Big D Ranch, but no trace of Frank was found. The Texas Rangers were called in on the third day, bringing additional resources, including helicopters with thermal imaging cameras. They scoured the countryside for a 20-mile radius but found nothing. As days turned into weeks, theories began to circulate. Some believed Frank had encountered a criminal element, perhaps drug smugglers using the remote ranch land as a transit route. Others whispered about possible financial troubles that might have driven him to stage his own disappearance. The more superstitious locals recalled old legends about the windmill being built on land considered sacred by indigenous peoples long before the Holden family arrived. Sheriff Grady focused his investigation on Hank Dawson, given their land dispute and the phone call on the day of the disappearance. Dawson admitted calling Frank but claimed it was merely to arrange a meeting to discuss a new offer for the property. He provided an alibi for the afternoon of September 12th, saying he was in San Antonio at his daughter's soccer tournament, an alibi confirmed by dozens of witnesses. As weeks turned to months, the search efforts dwindled. Margaret resisted selling the ranch or even leaving the property, clinging to the hope that Frank might return. She maintained his office exactly as he had left it, with half-finished paperwork still on the desk. James dropped out of college to help run the ranch, while Ellie threw herself into organizing community search efforts and maintaining a website about her father's case. The windmill became both a landmark for the search and a painful reminder of the mystery. Margaret couldn't bear to look at it, taking the long way around the property to avoid seeing its silhouette against the Texas sky. James, however, was drawn to it, often spending hours sitting in its shadow, as if waiting for the creaking metal to reveal its secrets. What the Holden family couldn't know was that Frank's final moments had indeed played out in the shadow of that windmill. On that Sunday afternoon, Frank had received a call not from a stranger or criminal, but from someone he knew well. The caller had asked to meet at the windmill, away from the house, away from Margaret's ears. Frank had agreed, suspecting this might finally resolve the tension that had been building all summer. When Frank arrived at the windmill, he parked and stepped out into the hot Texas afternoon. The wind was picking up, making the old metal structure groan as its blades turned faster. He shielded his eyes against the sun, scanning the horizon. He didn't immediately see the figure approaching from behind the concrete water tank that stood beside the windmill's base. Their conversation started calmly enough. Words were exchanged about money, about the future of the ranch, about secrets that had been kept too long. But as the discussion intensified, so did the wind. Dust began to swirl around them, a preview of the coming storm. When Frank turned to leave, to return to his truck and the safety of his home, a hand reached out to stop him. There was a struggle. In the chaos, Frank fell or was pushed, striking his head against the concrete edge of the water tank. The panicked perpetrator, seeing Frank motionless on the ground, made a split-second decision. Using Frank's own shovel from the truck bed, they dug frantically beneath the windmill's base, in soil softened by water seepage from the tank. The hole wasn't deep. It didn't need to be. Once Frank's body was concealed, they spread the remaining dirt evenly, then used branches to sweep away any signs of disturbance. The approaching dust storm would do the rest, erasing all evidence of what had transpired. For 25 years, the windmill kept its secret. The missing persons case of Frank Holden became one of those rural legends, a story told in hushed tones at the Crossroads Diner. Margaret never remarried, dedicating herself to maintaining the ranch and keeping Frank's memory alive. James took over the ranch operations, modernizing where he could while respecting his father's traditional approaches. Ellie eventually returned to Dryden County as a lawyer, specializing in representing small ranchers against corporate agricultural interests. In the years after Frank's disappearance, the windmill slowly fell into disrepair. Without Frank's meticulous maintenance, the mechanism began to fail. By 2010, it had stopped turning altogether, standing as a silent sentinel over the north pasture. James had installed modern solar-powered pumps elsewhere on the property, seeing no practical reason to repair the antique structure. Margaret, however, insisted it remain standing. "It was your father's favorite spot on the whole ranch," she would say, whenever James suggested dismantling it. In January 2024, a new figure arrived in Dryden County. Dr. Emily Reeves, a hydrologist from the University of Texas, came to study the region's declining water table. With drought conditions worsening across the state, her research aimed to help ranchers better manage their increasingly precious water resources. The Windbreak Ranch, with its historical records of water usage dating back to the 1930s, was a treasure trove of data for her project. Emily took an immediate interest in the old windmill. The location wasn't chosen randomly, she explained to James as they stood in its shadow one crisp January morning. "Your great-grandfather would have looked for specific geological indicators that suggested water was close to the surface. This spot tells us something important about the aquifer beneath your land." With Margaret's reluctant permission, Emily began conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys around the windmill's base. She was looking for the exact dimensions and depth of the aquifer access point, data that would help calibrate her models of water flow beneath the property. What she found instead were anomalies in the soil composition that she couldn't explain through geological processes. "There's something buried here," she told James one evening, showing him the readouts on her laptop. "Something large, about 6 feet down. It's not a natural formation." James initially dismissed her concerns, suggesting it might be old equipment or debris buried by his grandfather decades ago. But Emily was persistent. "Whatever it is, it's affecting the water flow patterns. For your ranch's future, we need to know what we're dealing with." Before they could decide on a course of action, nature intervened. On March 18, 2024, the worst dust storm in decades swept across West Texas. Wind speeds exceeded 70 mph, tearing roofs from barns and toppling power lines. At Windbreak Ranch, the old windmill finally surrendered to the elements. Its central tower, weakened by years of neglect, buckled under the strain. As it fell, the heavy metal structure drove deep into the ground, disturbing soil that had lain undisturbed for a quarter-century. When the storm cleared the next morning, James drove out to assess the damage across the property. At the site of the fallen windmill, he noticed something protruding from the disturbed earth, something that stopped him cold. A boot, a distinctive cream-colored Stetson, somehow preserved in the dry soil. And beneath it, human remains. Sheriff Liam Cortez, Tom Grady's successor, arrived within the hour. The site was quickly cordoned off as a potential crime scene. The Texas Rangers returned to Dryden County, this time with forensic anthropologists in tow. What they gradually unearthed was the answer to a 25-year-old mystery. Frank Holden had never left his beloved ranch. The medical examiner determined that Frank had died from blunt force trauma to the back of the head, consistent with a fall or blow against a hard object like the concrete water tank. The position of the body and other forensic evidence suggested his death might have been accidental, but his burial certainly was not. For Emily Reeves, what had begun as a hydrological study became a criminal investigation. Her ground-penetrating radar data now served a different purpose, helping investigators understand how the burial site had remained undetected for so long. The location beneath the windmill had been cunningly chosen. The regular seepage from the water tank had created a permanently disturbed soil pattern that would mask any human intervention. As news of the discovery spread through Dryden County, old suspicions resurfaced. Sheriff Cortez reopened the case file, reviewing interviews and evidence from 1999. His attention, like Grady's before him, turned to Hank Dawson and the land dispute. But Dawson had died in 2018, taking whatever knowledge he might have had to his grave. However, the fresh investigation uncovered new information. Bank records showed that Windbreak Ranch had been in far worse financial shape in 1999 than anyone had realized. Frank had taken out loans against the property that Margaret knew nothing about. using the money to cover gambling debts accrued at casinos in Louisiana. The ranch had been 3 months away from foreclosure when Frank disappeared. More surprisingly, Ellie Holden discovered, while reviewing her father's old correspondence, that Frank had actually agreed to sell the northern section to Dawson just days before his disappearance. A draft contract, never signed, was found in a folder in his office desk. The agreed price would have been enough to save the ranch from financial ruin. As Sheriff Cortez pieced together the evidence, a new theory emerged. The call Frank received at lunch that final day wasn't from Dawson, but from someone else who had learned about the impending land sale. Someone who had their own reasons for wanting to prevent it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Bill Hayward, now in his 80s and suffering from early-stage dementia, mentioned something during a routine interview that caught the investigators' attention. Margaret always said that Windmill was special, he recalled, said her grandfather built it himself, long before the Holdens ever came to this land. This contradicted the known history of the property. According to county records, the Holden family had been the first and only owners of the land since it was parceled out in the 1880s. When pressed, Hayward became confused, insisting that Margaret had told him stories about her family's connection to the Windmill. Sheriff Cortez requested a DNA comparison between soil samples taken from beneath Margaret's fingernails during her initial interview in 1999 and soil from Frank's burial site. Modern forensic techniques, unavailable at the time of Frank's disappearance, revealed a match. Furthermore, re-examination of the original case files showed that Margaret's alibi for the afternoon of September 12th, that she had been home alone, had never been properly verified. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more tragic than anyone had imagined. Margaret Holden had indeed been born Margaret Davis, granddaughter of Thomas Davis, who had homesteaded the land now called Windbreak Ranch in the 1870s. The Davis family had lost the property during the Depression, and it had eventually been acquired by the Holdens. Margaret had grown up hearing her grandfather's bitter stories about the land that should have been their family legacy. Her marriage to Frank Holden had not been a coincidence, but a calculated move to reclaim what she saw as her birthright. For 25 years, she had lived with the man whose family had, in her mind, stolen her inheritance. She had tolerated his financial mismanagement and even his occasional gambling trips. But when she discovered he planned to sell part of her land to Hank Dawson, the very section containing the windmill her grandfather had built, something in her snapped. The confrontation at the windmill had not been premeditated. Margaret had called Frank, asking him to meet her there before finalizing anything with Dawson. Their argument escalated as Frank revealed the full extent of their financial troubles. When he turned to leave, she grabbed his arm. He pulled away, lost his footing, and fell against the concrete tank. The decision to bury him there, beneath the symbol of her family's lost heritage, had been made in a moment of panic and strange, poetic justice. For 25 years, Margaret had lived with her secret, maintaining the facade of the grieving wife while working tirelessly to restore the ranch's finances and keep the land intact. In a twisted way, she had fulfilled Frank's responsibilities better than he had, turning Windbreak Ranch into a model of sustainable ranching practices and ensuring it would remain in the family for generations to come. When confronted with the evidence, Margaret Holden, now 74, confessed with a surprising calm. "I never meant to hurt him," she told Sheriff Cortez, "but I couldn't let him sell our land, not my grandfather's windmill, not to Dawson. Frank knew what that land meant to me, and he was going to sell it anyway." The arrest of Margaret Holden shocked Dryden County to its core. For James and Ellie, the revelation that their mother had been responsible for their father's death was devastating. The narrative they had constructed of their family history, of their parents' loving marriage, of their father's mysterious disappearance, crumbled in an instant. The legal proceedings were mercifully brief. Given Margaret's age, her clean record, and the circumstances of Frank's death, the district attorney agreed to a plea deal. Margaret pleaded guilty to manslaughter and concealment of a corpse, receiving a 10-year sentence, much of which would likely be served under house arrest due to her age and health. The old windmill, now fallen and revealed as both landmark and tombstone, was dismantled. Frank Holden was properly buried in the Dryden County Cemetery with both his children and, in a final irony, Margaret in attendance, escorted by deputies for the funeral service. As for Windbreak Ranch, its future remained uncertain. James and Ellie now understood that their inheritance was built on a foundation of lies and hidden history. The land that had been Davis, then Holden, now represented a legacy more complicated than they had ever imagined. Emily Reeves completed her hydrological study, providing James with a comprehensive water management plan that would help the ranch survive future droughts. In the process, she and James developed a relationship that offered him some comfort amid the ruins of his family narrative. In the end, the windmill's secret had been revealed not by human persistence, but by the same natural forces that had shaped the harsh beauty of West Texas: wind, dust, and time. The dust storm that exposed Frank Holden's remains was a reminder of nature's power to uncover what humans try to conceal. Today, a small memorial stands where the windmill once creaked in the Texas wind. It bears no names, only a simple inscription. Truth, like water, finds its way to the surface. For the people of Dryden County, the case of Frank Holden's disappearance was finally closed. But the questions it raised about family, legacy, and the lengths to which people will go to protect what they believe is rightfully theirs would linger like dust in the air after a Texas storm. As for Margaret, in the twilight of her life, she found a strange peace in no longer carrying her secret alone. The windmill was always watching, she told Ellie during one prison visit. For 25 years it stood there, knowing. Every time it creaked, it was speaking his name. Maybe that's why I couldn't bear to take it down, even when it stopped working. It was his marker, his monument. In a way, I'm glad it finally told its story.